Good afternoon. As is apparent from my background, I'm sitting outdoors, actually vacationing in Tennessee, which is appropriate given that I'm going to be discussing a facet of the Scopes trial of 1925. As best described by essayist Kristy Maddux, those considering the legacy of fundamentalist William Jennings Bryan are confronted with an intractable paradox. On one hand, Bryan was a nationally renowned fundamentalist speaker and politician, yet he stumbled badly when defending creationism during the Scopes trial of 1925. Secondly, he was a cutting-edge American progressive reformer, yet an outspoken Christian who hewed to a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. Maddux argues Bryan's strategic error was to employ a populist approach instead of a fundamentalist argumentative framework during the Scopes trial. By understanding Bryan's rhetorical framework, it becomes apparent that he was neither idiot nor fool. And this essay will briefly summarize Maddux's thesis and key arguments using comparisons with Bryan's own words and comparisons to other scholarship. To briefly recap the events leading to the Scopes trial, Tennessee passed the Butler Act in 1925, prohibiting the teaching of either asserting mankind was evolved from lower life forms or denying divine creation. In a form of a public relations stunt, a Dayton, Tennessee coal plant manager concocted a stage trial to challenge the Butler Law using support from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, with John T. Scopes, local teacher, as the case subject. News of the event prompted William Jennings Bryan, as we touched on, outspoken fundamentalist and arguably America's best-known public speaker of the time, to join the prosecution, which was headed largely by Clarence Darrow, prominent trial lawyer, and he was a blunt agnostic, essentially turning this juvenile publicity stunt into a nationally followed debate on evolution. The Scopes trial began on 10 July 1925 and lasted for 12 days, with daily reports of the verbal duels between prosecution and defense transmitted worldwide via radio and telegraph. Towards the end, Bryan blundered badly by agreeing to take the witness stand, and where he was badgered by Darrow into contradicting the interpretation of 6 literal days for creation. Afterwards, the judge ended the trial with a guilty plea from Scopes, effectively denying Bryan the ability to cross-examine Darrow. And as a consequence of the heat and stress, Bryan died 5 days later. But in the court of public opinion, Bryan was painted as a narrow-minded zealot, and with opinions shaped largely by a hostile press media, particularly from outspoken atheist H.L. Mencken. It's important first to note that despite his prominence as a fundamentalist, Bryan was not a trained theologian, but he did have deeply settled convictions as to the inerrancy of the Bible. And he also believed that knowledge of God and the Bible was an essential basis to morality and social justice. C. Allen Russell's essay highlights how Bryan's theology was firmly grounded in the present, focused on improving society by following Jesus' example. During his years in politics, Bryan was a cutting-edge progressive, championing many progressive reforms such as temperance and women's suffrage. Understanding Bryan's mix of fundamentalism and progressivism is essential to grasping his approach to the Scopes trial. Not only did evolution contradict the biblical account of creation, Darwin's theories undermined biblically based morals by encouraging the law of the jungle. Now, Bryan did not oppose the teaching of evolution, as he argued in a New York Times article of 21 June 1923, quote, "Please note that the objection is not to the teaching of the evolutionary hypothesis, but teaching of it as a true or proven fact." In line with Bryan's populism, his undelivered final argument, published post-mortem in the 29 July 1925 edition of the Washington Post, challenged the morality of an elite minority using the power of the state to usurp parental rights and to shield their children from the teaching of unbiblical theories. So this last point, missed by most of Bryan's critics, is key to understanding his populist approach to the trial. By defending the Butler Act, Bryan was protecting common folk against the immoral imposition of evolution by an anti-Christian elite. Instead of using a framework of empirical reasoning as developed by the fundamentalists, a group to which he did not truly belong, Bryan instead employed his tried and true populist rhetoric. Thus, Maddux concludes Bryan's failure to answer Darrow's questions should not suggest Bryan's foolishness so much as the dissonance between the two men's argumentative frames. Bryan treated Darwinism as a moral system, not an empirical explanation of the world. So he was ill-prepared when Darrow pushed him to oppose Darwinism on empirical grounds. So it's evident that William Jennings Bryan was not a fool, but employed a populist approach found wanting. Bryan's argument on 16 July 1925 against admitting expert witnesses bears out this fact. The people of the state passed this law. They knew what they were doing and knew the dangers of the doctrine. They did not want it taught to their children. It isn't proper to bring experts in here to try and defeat the purpose of the people of this state. And thank you for listening today, and this concludes my presentation.